This week, Dangerous Tides returns to the Great Lakes. This time, we're off to Lake Michigan to take a look at royalty. However, much like the Cedarville and the Kamloops before her, the Queen of the Lake found out that even royalty isn't immune from the wrath of Mother Nature. So climb aboard the Carl D. Bradley as we set sail on Dangerous Tides. The Bradley began life as Hull 797 at the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio. She was launched April 9, 1927, where she was outfitted with her fore and aft housing in the ensuing months until her maiden voyage, when her namesake, Carl David Bradley, the president of Michigan Limestone, Bradley's wife, and the Rogers City Community Band, along with hundreds of Rogers City's residents, as she steamed into Calcite Harbor on July 28, 1927. Bradley declared that the new ship was the last word in freighter construction. The United States Coast Guard would describe her as follows: a typical arrangement for a self-unloading type vessels with a forepeak and large cargo area, and having a propulsion machinery aft. These areas were separated by two transverse watertight bulkheads, the collision bulkhead at frame 12 and the engine room forward bulkhead at 173. The cargo hold space was divided into 5 compartments by screen bulkheads above the tunnel, and the unloading of the machinery was located in the conveyor room just forward of the cargo spaces. The entire 475-foot length of the cargo space was open longitudinally through the tunnel and the conveyor room. The Carl D. Bradley was the flagship of the Bradley Transportation Company and would consistently carry honored guests and corporate officials in her staterooms. Because of her status, she would receive more attention than most of her peers. Her red and gray paint would always be refreshed, her decks always toes down, and she would have more crew than most of her peers. She had individual rooms for the captain, chief mates, chief steward, and engine room officers. The rest of the crew were housed in comfortable dormitory-style rooms. She had a state-of-the-art galley with huge refrigeration units and storage pantries. Her engine room housed a huge generator powered by 2 Foster Wheeler boilers. The Carl D. Bradley was the only fully electric ship in the Bradley transportation fleet. Her generator powered everything from the propeller to the running lights. This steamer was 638 feet long overall, with a 65-foot beam, a depth of 33 feet, and a cargo capacity of 14,000 tons of crushed stone. The unloading boom was 160 feet long. The boilers on the Bradley were water tube boilers instead of the usual fire tube boiler. Her method of propulsion was provided by the use of turboelectric drive, and the Bradley was only the second ship built using this technology. There were other innovations in the Carl D. Bradley. The auxiliary machinery, the unloading equipment, and galley were powered with electricity, with the power coming from the main motor. The vessel was equipped with the latest navigational devices such as a gyro compass and gyro pilot radio detection finder. For its day, the Bradley was the most up-to-date and largest steamer on the Great Lakes, and she was recognized as the Queen of the Lakes. The Carl D. Bradley carried different grades of limestone through Lake Huron to deep water ports in Lakes Michigan and Erie, and occasionally on Lake Superior. She set new records in stone trade, carrying her largest cargo in 1929 when she loaded with 18,405 tons of limestone, a cargo that would require 300 railroad cars to move. She was the first lake freighter to pass through the new MacArthur Lock at the Sioux Locks in 1943. As the largest ship on the lakes, the Carl D. Bradley traditionally was the first boat through the Straits of Marinac, where the ice kept the smaller vessels from leaving port. She served as an icebreaker. Her forepeak was filled with concrete. She would break ice to Indiana and then go to the Lorraine shipyard for replacement of broken plates before starting her season. Carl D. Bradley sustained damage in a collision with the MV White Rose on the St. Clair River on April 3, 1957. She was in dry dock in Chicago for 7 days in May of 1957 for major repairs to her hull. Carl D. Bradley had 2 groundings while proceeding out of Cedarville, Michigan, one in the spring of 1958, the other in November of that year, the latter of which would require repairs. These groundings were not reported to the United States Coast Guard, which would later consider whether the groundings caused hull stress that contributed to the Carl D. Bradley sinking. The Coast Guard also noted that although the Bradley Transportation received an award for 2,228,775 injury-free man-hours from April 24, 1955 to December 31, 1957, while operating the Carl D. Bradley, the company's focus was on industrial safety rather than the material safety of the vessel. Since the company's founding in 1912, it had never lost a ship until the Carl D. Bradley. The Bradley made her last delivery on the 1958 season to Bluffington, Indiana, and was set out that evening on November the 17th on her final return home. The weather was already a challenge. Winds blew at 35 miles an hour, and cold and warm fronts were mingling over the plains. The weather in Chicago had dropped 20 degrees over the course of the day, and the forecast was ominous. The crew prepared for severe weather by securing the unloading boom and the hatches. The steamer followed the route up Wisconsin shore to Cana Island, then changed course and cut across Lake Michigan towards Lansing Shoal. As the wind velocity increased, the crew filled the ballast tanks to the maximum practical condition. By 4 p.m. the next day, November the 18th, the winds had already reached 65 miles an hour. Even though the lake was rough and the winds were high, the boat rode the heavy seas with no hint of an issue. Captain Bryant had asked the cooks to serve an early dinner. He knew the turn from Lake Michigan towards Lake Huron would put heavy weather on the broadside of the vessel. He wanted to give the mess crew the opportunity to clean up and secure before turning. About 5:30 p.m., First Mate Elmer Fleming radioed Calcite that the Bradley would arrive at 2 a.m. Then, a loud thud. In the pilot house, Captain Bryant and Fleming looked aft and saw the stern sag. Fleming immediately sent a distress signal over the radio.
Mayday! Mayday! This is the Carl D. Bradley. Our position is approximately 12 miles southwest of Gull Island. We are in serious trouble. We are breaking up.
Captain Bryan sounded the general alarm, signaled the engine room to stop the ship, and blew the whistle to abandon ship. However, the power system failed, and the lights in the bow section went out. The Bradley heaved upward near amidships and broke in two. The forward section rolled over and sank. The stern plunged to the bottom. Within a few minutes, the Carl D. Bradley was gone. Elmer Fleming's account was harrowing. The first 10 minutes, he realized he did not have a life jacket. He went to his stateroom 2 decks below to get the life jacket and returned to the deck of the pilot house where he found the life raft. He saw Captain Byron and other crew members pulling themselves along the boat's railing to the high side of the bow. The forward section was listing to the port side. Suddenly, the bow lurched, and he fell into the water. When he came to the surface, the forward section was gone, and he saw the after section swing to the port side. With the propeller high in the air, the stern plunged to the bottom with the light still burning. As the stern section plunged, there was an explosion and a flash of flame. The water had reached the boilers. Coast Guard radio station WAD, Port Washington, Wisconsin, heard the Bradley's mayday. Radio silence was ordered except for emergency messages, and rescue operations began. Lieutenant Commander Harold Muth, commanding officer of the Coast Guard cutter Sundew, piloted the vessel out. The weather was fierce. In a video recording, Muth said the waves were 20 feet high and the winds were out of the south to southwest at 50 to 55 miles an hour. Gusts were up to 65 miles an hour. Visibility was about 75 to 100 feet. The forecast indicated the storm would be strengthening. The cutter Sundew arrived at the scene of the last reported location of the Bradley around 10:45 p.m. and began the search using searchlight. As the search continued, the seas increased to 25 feet, with the winds increasing to 65 miles an hour, rolling in the heavy seas. One of the vessels joining the search was the German cargo ship Christian Statori. This vessel had recently passed the Bradley and was 4 miles away when the distress signal was sounded. Despite the raging storm, Captain Paul Mueller, master of the Christian Statori, had changed course and headed back to join the search. Returning to the scene took an hour. The crew of the German ship searched for survivors using flares. Captain Mueller signaled they had spotted only a tank and a raincoat. Mays and Fleming later indicated that the Christian Statori passed them by about 1/2 mile away. The tank may have been their raft. Fleming tried desperately to light the last flare as the Statori neared. The wet flare would not ignite. The Statori, at the request of Captain Muth, assisted in the search until about 1:30 a.m. Sometime after the German ship left the scene, the steamer Robert C. Stanley had joined in the search, as did the Coast Guard cutter Hollyhock. Coast Guard aircraft were dropping flares, but the flares were not effective due to the poor visibility. Around 8 a.m., a lookout on the Sundew told Captain Muth that he saw something ahead in the water. It turned out to be a raft with 2 men on it. When the cutter pulled alongside the raft, the 2 crewmen jumped to the raft to assist Mays and Fleming onto the cutter. The survivors were stiff and cold, unable to stand, and needed assistance to get aboard the Sundew. Warren Toussaint, the cutter's corpsman, said the survivors had icicles in their hair. Rescuers took the men to the chief's quarters on the cutter, wrapped in blankets, and had their vital signs checked. The corpsman fed them a little beef broth every half hour. The rescue party continued to search for survivors. Mays and Fleming requested to stay on board the cutter Sundew during the search for the shipmate. The Sundew was moored portside to at the Coast Guard buoy depot in a small channel between Round Lake and Lake Charlevoix. It was customary to get underway by going through the open railroad bridge at Lake Charlevoix, turn around, go back through the railroad bridge into Round Lake, blow the signal to open the highway bridge, and then proceed down the channel into Lake Michigan. The Sundew had trouble getting back through the railroad bridge opening because the strong winds kept blowing the ship off course until finally the ship had to proceed at an angle in order to reach the opening at just the right moment and at the correct speed. The location of the Bradley was proving difficult. The maelstrom now caused almost all of the crew who had responded to the recall to be seasick. After rounding a point of land and moving west to northwest direction, the real fury of the waves took effect. Some of the radio equipment shorted out because water sloshed into the radio room just aft of the bridge. Radio Cleveland called the Sundew, but she could not reply. Everyone on the bridge heard Radio Cleveland ask everyone in the area if they could see Sundew. After reaching the last location of the Bradley and not finding any trace of the ship, they initiated a search grid, which meant the Sundew took the full fury of the wind and the wave ultimately on the port and then the starboard side. The only relief came for a few minutes as the ship turned to run with the wind before again turning in the grid. They turned on the searchlight on the flying bridge and swung it from side to side. Occasionally, they saw a body, but before they could make any attempt to recover the body, it was out of the beam of light. The Sundew would also make contact with a foreign vessel, the only ship that had seen the demise of the Bradley. It was difficult to communicate with the foreign ship because of the language problems. She did offer to search in the immediate area, but informed Captain Muth that she had to get to Chicago in order to return and clear the St. Lawrence Seaway before it closed to navigation for the winter. During the entire rescue effort, the Sundew was sealed. No one was allowed outside, not even onto the bridge. Because of the mooring status, sailors had not tied down everything, and there was no time before departure. Gas bottles broke loose and rolled over the side. Every can of paint in the forward locker burst. They even found paint sloshing 2 feet deep when the locker was finally opened several days after the event. Because of the difficulty in moving about, many of the crew tied themselves to the mess tables to prevent injury. No one went below the crew's quarters. Between manning the searchlight and checking on the crew, the corpsmen had to report their status to the captain. The ship rolled several times in excess of 50 degrees with water spraying down the stack, causing sputtering in the main electric board in the engine room. At 4 a.m. on the 19th, the corpsmen lay below, tried to get some rest because the captain had determined they needed the corpsmen's services after daylight. The HM2 lay below to sick bay, where he would loosely tie himself to a bunk. The winds had begun to abate. The seas were not as rough. Suddenly, about 8:15 a.m., the corpsman awoke to a new crew member telling him that a raft had been spotted with at least 2 men on board. He ran out to the buoy deck and saw a raft about 500 feet off the port side. The team brought blankets and stretchers. All hands responded to the welcome sight of possible survivors. The captain maneuvered the Sundew alongside the raft, which was then tied to the ship. They let a cargo net over the side. A bosun mate went down to assist the 2 survivors. He literally threw each man up on the buoy deck, where they wrapped them in blankets, placed them on stretchers, and took them to the chief's quarters, where there was sufficient room for them to be attended to properly. The 2 survivors were in good shape despite the ordeal. At 9:15 a.m., the Sundew sent a message stating, "Picked up 2 survivors on raft 5.25 miles from Gull Island." The 2 survivors had been on the raft for almost 15 hours and fell into the water several times as the raft capsized. The other 2 men who had been on the raft attempted to swim ashore during the night, but both were lost. Coast Guard aircraft notified Sundew of bodies in the water, and a sighting overturned the lifeboat on the shore of one of its small islands in the area. After making sure there were no more survivors, the Sundew sent a small boat out to recover the lifeboat, which was empty. All the bodies they took from the lake and checked for any sign of life and identified. They placed all personal effects in envelopes and marked them accordingly. The Coast Guard Marine Board investigation found that the Carl D. Bradley sank from excessive hogging stresses. The Marine Board reported that 4 vessels were crossing Lake Michigan parallel or ahead of the Carl D. Bradley during the storm, and that 8 other vessels sought shelter at the time of the casualty. They concluded that Bryan exercised poor judgment when he decided to leave the shelter of the Wisconsin shore and sail into the open lake during the storm. However, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Vice Admiral A.C. Richmond, issued his own report that disproved the Marine Board's conclusion that Bryan used poor judgment. Richmond noted that his conclusion was supported by the vessel's 31-year history of the Great Lakes navigation and the report that it was sailing smoothly prior to its sinking. His report also rejected that hogging stresses caused the Carl D. Bradley to sink, instead concluding she broke up due to, quote, undetected structural weaknesses or defect. Following their investigation of the Carl D. Bradley sinking, the Marine Board made the following safety recommendation. Mechanical changes should be made in the way lifeboats are disengaged and deployed. A second life raft should be mandatory on the Great Lakes cargo ships because they land upright no matter how they're overturned. Each lifeboat should be equipped with 2 tow ropes. 6 parachute-type flare signals with equipment for firing them skyward should be stored on each lifeboat and life raft. The cork and canvas life vests should be updated to include crotch straps and collars that support the neck. The Great Lakes shipping industry later replaced the rigid, open rafts like the one carried on the Carl D. Bradley with inflatable life rafts with an enclosed canopy for protection against the weather. In 1968, the National Transportation Safety Board gave notice to the Coast Guard Commandant that the structural failure sustained by the SS Edward Y. Townsend, Carl D. Bradley, and Daniel J. Morrell could reoccur under certain circumstances. The NTSB recommended that the Coast Guard take action to implement a progressive structural renewal of ships that were constructed prior to 1948. Carl D. Bradley's estimated value at the time of her loss was $8 million, making her the most costly shipwreck in Great Lakes history. United States Steel initially offered $660,000 as a settlement. Family members of the lost crewmen felt that U.S. Steel used the Coast Guard findings to avoid responsibility for the Bradley. The company believed that their 1959 survey results of the wreck supported the position that her loss was an act of God. 10 families filed lawsuits seeking more than $7 million just weeks after the Coast Guard report was released. U.S. Steel reached a $1.25 million lump sum settlement 1 year and 16 days after the sinking. A commissioner was appointed to determine how the settlement money would be divided among the families. The settlement would not guarantee lifelong financial security for the victims' families. One published source said the settlement was, quote, one of the fastest in maritime history for a case of its scope. Of the 35 crewmen, 33 died in the sinking. 23 were from Rogers City, Michigan, a town with 3,873 residents. 23 women were widowed and 53 children became fatherless. 2 Carl D. Bradley wives had children on the way. The largest mass funeral service was held at St. Agnes Catholic Church for 9 of the recovered victims. Friends and relatives would nearly double the town's population during the funerals and memorial services. There was a funeral on every street. Rogers City's mayor issued an official proclamation declaring every November 18th would be dedicated to the memory of the men lost on the ship. The Mariners Church of Detroit, Michigan, offered special prayers for the vessel's sailors. Ships at sea dropped their anchor at noon for memorial services for those lost on the Carl D. Bradley. The Detroit News established the Carl D. Bradley Ship Disaster Fund and contributed $1,000 to set it up. Donations came in from across the country, ranging from Michigan Limestone's $10,000 contribution to collections aboard commercial ships to individual donations. On August 9th, 1997, a memorial in Rogers City's Lakeside Park was dedicated to the 33 men who lost their lives on the Carl D. Bradley and the Cedarville. The bell from the Carl D. Bradley was returned to Rogers City in 2007. It was restored and unveiled in a ceremony held on the weekend of the 49th anniversary of the sinking. On November 17th, 2008, a 50th anniversary memorial was held at the Great Lakes Lore Maritime Museum in Rogers City when the bell was tolled to commemorate the crew. The documentary, November Requiem, premiered at Rogers City Theater during the ceremonies. It used author Andrew Cantor's book, Black November, as a major source and focused on the repercussion of the small community of Rogers City after the Carl D. Bradley sank. The documentary was featured on PBS in 2008, and in 2010, it won 2 Emmy Awards for Best Historical Documentary and Best Original Music Score. And thus ends the story of the Carl D. Bradley. Her loss would not only devastate towns, but would begin the slow demise of the Bradley Transportation Company. However, the lessons learned from the Bradley has saved thousands of lives every year. So perhaps the crew's death isn't truly in vain. If you want to learn more about the Carl D. Bradley, I suggest you watch November Requiem. If you've enjoyed this episode of Dangerous Tides, please like and subscribe. And until next time, may the fair winds guide you through dangerous tides.